2,000 years ago, one man walked through a small, turbulent corner of the Roman Empire and taught something so radical it still unsettles people today. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, forgive, not once, not 7 times, but 77 times. If someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. If someone takes from you, give more. And perhaps most mysterious of all, the kingdom of God is in your midst. Luke 17:21. Not in a temple, not in a priesthood, not in a ritual, within you. Which raises a strange question. If that was the message, how did we end up with 2,000 years of religious institutions, theological arguments, denominations, and wars fought in his name? How did a teacher who spoke almost entirely about love, forgiveness, and unity become the center of one of the largest and most complex religious traditions in human history? And maybe an even stranger question, who was he, really? To some, Jesus is the Son of God, the divine incarnation sent to redeem humanity. To others, he was a prophet, one of the many teachers in long history of spiritual traditions. Some historians see him simply as a Jewish reformer, a charismatic preacher whose ideas spread far beyond his lifetime. Others argue he may have been a mythological figure, a symbolic story that grew over centuries. And yet, no matter which interpretation someone believes, one fact remains difficult to ignore. The influence of this one man reshaped the spiritual landscape of the planet. Billions of people across thousands of cultures, across 2 millennia of history, still debate his words, his life, and his meaning, which makes the central mystery even deeper. What was he actually trying to teach? Because when you strip away the layers of theology, doctrine, and tradition, his message seems surprisingly simple: love God, love one another, forgive endlessly, see yourself in others, which sounds beautiful in theory until someone cuts you off in traffic. And that simplicity may actually be the most confusing part of the entire story. Because teachings like these don't usually reshape civilizations. Political revolutions do, military victories do, technological breakthroughs do. But a message about love and forgiveness? That's not typically how empires are built. And yet, somehow, the words of this wandering teacher from ancient Judea traveled across continents, through languages and cultures, and eventually became one of the most influential spiritual traditions in human history. But what if the story we inherited is only part of the picture? Because hidden in a series of transcripts recorded in the early 1980s, a very unusual source offered a completely different description of who Jesus was. Not as a king, not as a god, not even primarily as a religious leader, but as something else entirely. According to the Law of One material, Jesus may have been something known as a wanderer, a being from a higher level of consciousness who voluntarily incarnated on Earth for a very specific purpose. And if that idea sounds strange, well, that's where things start to get interesting. Because according to this material, Jesus wasn't here to start a religion, he wasn't here to build an institution, and he may not have intended to become the center of a global belief system at all. Instead, the Law of One suggests something far more provocative: that the life of Jesus was meant to demonstrate a possibility, not something humanity should worship, but something humanity could eventually become. And to understand why that might be, we first need to look at the man history remembers, the Jesus of Judea, the teacher who walked the dusty roads of the Roman province 2,000 years ago. Because before we explore the unusual explanation offered by the Law of One, we need to understand the story that most of the world already knows. To understand the story of Jesus, we have to go back to a very specific time and place, the early 1st century, a small region of the eastern Mediterranean known as Judea. At the time, Judea was not an independent nation. It was a province of the Roman Empire. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets, Roman governors controlled the law, Roman taxes drained the population, and the Jewish people living there carried a long and complicated history. For centuries, their culture had been built around a single idea: that they were a people in covenant with one God, the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, the God who, according to their scriptures, had delivered them from slavery in Egypt and guided them through the wilderness. Their religious texts, what we now call the Hebrew Bible, were filled with promises of a coming figure, a Messiah, an anointed leader, someone who would restore justice, renew the nation, and bring about the fulfillment of God's plan. By the time the Roman Empire ruled Judea, many people believed the arrival of this Messiah was imminent. The land was tense. Political uprisings were not uncommon. Prophets and revolutionary figures appeared regularly, claiming divine authority or promising liberation. Into this atmosphere, sometime around the late 1st century BC or early 1st century AD, A child was born in the region of Galilee. His name in Aramaic would have been Yeshua. In English, we know him as Jesus. According to the gospel accounts in the New Testament, his birth itself was already wrapped in symbolism and prophecy. The Gospel of Matthew describes visitors from the east arriving after seeing a mysterious star. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Matthew 2:2. The Gospel of Luke tells another version of the story, a more humble one. Mary and Joseph arriving in Bethlehem, no room at the inn, a child born among animals in the manger. Whether taken literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, these stories became the foundation of the Christian narrative. But historians often focus on something slightly more different: the fact that, by most accounts, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, a small and relatively unremarkable village in Galilee. Not a center of political power, not a religious capital, just another rural settlement in the Roman province. And for roughly 30 years, very little is recorded about his life, which has led historians to refer to this period as the hidden years of Jesus. 30 years of silence, which in modern terms would be the equivalent of someone suddenly appearing on the world stage with zero social media history. Then, according to the Gospels, something changed. Around the age of 30, Jesus began traveling throughout the region, teaching publicly. He spoke in parables, short stories that carried moral and spiritual meaning. He spoke about the kingdom of God, not as a distant heaven, but as something already present among people. The kingdom of God is in your midst. Luke 17:21. His teachings emphasized themes that were both familiar and surprisingly radical: compassion, humility, forgiveness. He taught that loving one's neighbor was central to spiritual life. Love your neighbor as yourself. Mark 12:31. But he didn't stop there. He expanded the definition of neighbor to include even one's enemies. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. In a society deeply structured around honor, law, and social hierarchy, these teachings were startling. But they were not the only reason people began paying attention to him. The Gospels also describe a series of miraculous events: healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, feeding thousands of people with a few loaves of bread, calming storms, even raising the dead. Whether interpreted literally, metaphorically, or as later theological storytelling, these accounts played a powerful role in spreading his reputation. Crowds began to gather. Followers, later called disciples, traveled with him, and word of his teachings began to move quickly through the region. But popularity can be complicated, particularly in a land already under political tension. Some religious authorities saw his teachings as disruptive. Some political authorities saw large crowds as potential instability. And some people began asking a dangerous question: could this man be the Messiah? The long awaited king who would restore Israel? Jesus' own responses to that question were complex. In some moments, he appeared to avoid the title. In others, he seemed to accept it indirectly. One of the most famous moments occurs in the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus asks his disciples who they believe he is, Simon Peter responds, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Matthew 16:16. Whatever interpretation people place on his identity, the tension surrounding him continued to grow. Eventually, the Gospels describe a final journey to Jerusalem, the religious and political center of Judea. Crowds welcomed him as he entered the city. Hosanna to the Son of David, Matthew 21:9. But within days, the situation changed dramatically. According to the Gospel accounts, tensions reached a breaking point after Jesus entered the temple in Jerusalem and confronted the merchants and money changers operating there. Overturning their tables, he accused them of turning a sacred place into a marketplace. "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." Matthew 21:13. For the religious authorities, this was more than a symbolic protest. It was a public challenge to the authority of the temple leadership, the center of Jewish religious life. The Gospels describe a growing concern among the chief priests and elders that Jesus' influence over large crowds could destabilize the region. In the Gospel of John, they are recorded saying, "If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." John 11:48. Eventually, Jesus was arrested during the night in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was first questioned by members of the Jewish council, where accusations of blasphemy were raised after he spoke about his relationship with God. But because Judea was under Roman rule, religious leaders did not have the authority to carry out a death sentence. So Jesus was brought before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. There, the charges shifted from religious claims to political ones. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was accused of presenting himself as a king, a direct challenge to Roman authority. We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Luke 23:2. Whether Pilate personally believed the accusations or not, the situation had become volatile. Crowds had gathered, tensions were rising, and ultimately, the Roman governor authorized the punishment reserved for rebels and insurrectionists: crucifixion. According to the gospel accounts, he was crucified outside the city walls, and in the final moments of his life, the Gospel of Luke records him saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. Which may be one of the most striking lines in the entire story. A man being executed, asking forgiveness for the people responsible. After his death, the Gospels claim something even more extraordinary: that 3 days later, the tomb where he had been placed was found empty, and that his followers encountered him again, alive. The New Testament records multiple moments in which people claim to see or speak with him after the crucifixion. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus near the empty tomb, initially mistaking him for a gardener. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," meaning teacher. John 20:16. Later, the Gospel of Luke describes Jesus appearing to two followers walking on the road to Emmaus, speaking with them for hours before they recognized him. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Luke 24:31. Another passage describes Jesus appearing to the disciples together, inviting them to touch his wounds. "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Luke 24:39. These post resurrection appearances became central to the beliefs of the early Christian community. For his followers, they were not simply stories of survival, they were a confirmation that Jesus' life and his teachings carried a meaning far beyond the events of his execution. This event, the resurrection, became the central belief of Christianity. From there, the movement spread rapidly, first among Jewish communities, then throughout the wider Roman world. Within a few centuries, the teachings of Jesus had grown from a small group of followers in Judea into one of the largest religious traditions in human history. But even after 2,000 years of scholarship, theology, and debate, historians still disagree about many aspects of the story. Some view Jesus primarily as a Jewish apocalyptic teacher, others see him as a social reformer, others as a spiritual mystic, and others believe the gospel accounts are primarily theological narratives rather than historical biographies. What almost everyone agrees on is that the figure at the center of the story remains one of the most influential individuals who ever lived. But the deeper question still lingers. Who was he, really? A prophet? A miracle worker? A divine incarnation? Or something else entirely? Because according to the law of one, there may be another way to interpret the life of Jesus. One that reframes not only who he was, but why he came here in the first place. And to understand that explanation, we have to step briefly away from ancient Judea and into a very different conversation, one that took place nearly 2,000 years later, a series of discussions that would eventually become known as the Law of One. Nearly 2,000 years after the events described in the Gospels, another conversation about Jesus began to emerge. Not in ancient Judea, not in Rome, but in a quiet house in Louisville, Kentucky, in the early 1980s. Between 1981 and 1984, three researchers, Don Elkins, Carl Ruckert, and Jim McCarthy, conducted a series of sessions they believed to be a form of telepathic communication with a collective intelligence identifying itself as Ra. Over the course of these sessions, hundreds of questions were asked about topics ranging from cosmology and consciousness to evolution of intelligent life to the spiritual history of Earth. The material that emerged from those conversations eventually became known as the Law of One. Whether someone views the source of these dialogues as genuine contact, subconscious channeling, philosophical exploration, or simply an unusual spiritual experiment, the ideas contained within them are remarkably detailed. And among those ideas is a framework for understanding reality as a progression of densities of consciousness. If you watched the previous episode in the series, you'll remember the Law of One describes the universe as evolving through seven primary densities. Not densities of matter, but densities of awareness. Each density representing a stage in the development of consciousness. First density, the elements: earth, air, fire, water. Second density, biological life, plants and animals. Third density, Self aware beings capable of making moral choices, which conveniently is where humanity currently finds itself. According to the law of one, the purpose of third density is learning to make a fundamental choice in consciousness, a choice between two primary paths: service to others, the path of compassion, cooperation, and unity, or service to self, the path of control, separation, and power. This choice determines how consciousness evolves into the next stage, the next density, fourth density, a level of awareness centered around love and understanding. In the law of one framework, beings who have developed deeply along the path of compassion begin to experience reality very differently. The boundaries between self and others begin to soften. Empathy becomes natural, unity becomes intuitive. And according to this philosophy, some beings who have already evolved beyond third density sometimes choose to incarnate voluntarily into less developed worlds. These beings are known as wanderers, individuals who temporarily take on the limitations of a lower density life in order to help guide or assist the evolution of a civilization. Which brings us back to Jesus, because during one of the Raw sessions, the researchers asked a direct question about him: who was he? And what was his role in human history? Ra's answer was surprisingly specific. In session 17, question 11, the questioner asks about the identity of Jesus. Ra responds, "The one known to you as Jesus of Nazareth did not have a name. This entity was a member of fourth density of the highest level of that sub-octave. The entity was desirous of entering this planetary sphere in order to share the love vibration in as pure a manner as possible." In other words, according to the law of one, Jesus was not described as a deity, not as the sole divine incarnation of God, but as a fourth density being, a consciousness already developed in a density associated with love and compassion, a wanderer who chose to incarnate in third density human form. And the purpose of that incarnation, according to Ra, was simple: to share the vibration of love as purely as possible, which begins to make the teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels sound a little bit different. Love your enemies, forgive endlessly, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. From the perspective of the law of one, these weren't merely moral instructions, they were descriptions of how consciousness behaves in fourth density, which raises an interesting possibility that if the life of Jesus wasn't meant to demonstrate that one person was divine, but to show humanity what the next stage of consciousness looks like, what if the life of Jesus wasn't meant to demonstrate that one person was divine, but to show humanity what the next stage of consciousness looks like? And if that interpretation is even partially true, it leads to another question. Why would a being from a higher density voluntarily enter a world like ours? A world filled with conflict, confusion, and the occasional comment section? According to the law of one, there is a very specific reason, and it has everything to do with the evolution of consciousness itself. If the law of one description of Jesus is accurate, then the most important detail in that explanation is this: Jesus was described as a fourth density being. But to understand why that matters, we need to understand what fourth density actually represents. In the law of one cosmology, fourth density is often called a density of love, not love in the sentimental sense, not the kind of love that depends on agreement or personal preference, but a much deeper form of awareness. A recognition that the separation between self and others is, in many ways, an illusion. That the same consciousness expressing itself in you is expressing itself in everyone else. In session 16, question 21, Ra describes the nature of fourth density in this way. The fourth density is one of love and understanding. It is not of words unless chosen. It is not of heavy chemical vehicles for body complex activities. It is a plane of a denser and more full life. In other words, fourth density represents a stage of consciousness in which compassion becomes the natural orientation of the mind. Helping others is no longer viewed as sacrifice, because others are no longer experienced as truly separate. And when you look back at the teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, they begin to sound remarkably similar to this description. He repeatedly encouraged people to treat others as extensions of themselves. So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. He encouraged forgiveness not once, but endlessly. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Matthew 18:22. And perhaps most famously, he extended compassion even to those considered enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. From a purely historical perspective, Teachings like these are often described as moral philosophy, but from the perspective of the law of one, they may be something slightly different. They may be descriptions of how a fourth density consciousness naturally behaves, not commandments, not rules, simply the way perception changes when the illusion of separation begins to dissolve. Which makes another passage from the raw material particularly interesting. In session 17, question 15, the questioner asks Ra to explain more about the nature of Jesus. Ra responds, "This entity was a wanderer of fourth density. It remembered the love vibration more than most wanderers do." That phrase is important. Remember the love vibration. According to the law of one, when wanderers incarnate into third density, they normally experience something similar to what the material calls the veil of forgetting, a kind of amnesia that prevents them from remembering their origin. Without that veil, the lessons of third density, choice, faith, uncertainty, would be far too easy. So even highly evolved beings enter human life with the same basic limitations as everyone else. They grow up, they learn, they experience confusion and doubt, but occasionally, a wanderer may retain a slightly stronger connection to their original awareness. Not a full memory, more like a deep intuition, a sense that compassion, unity, and forgiveness are the natural orientation of consciousness. According to Ra, Jesus was one of those rare wanderers, someone who retained a strong awareness of that love vibration. And if that interpretation is correct, then his teachings were not attempts to establish a religious system. They were simply expressions of the level of consciousness he had already developed, which might explain why so many of his statements seemed confusing. For example, when he said, "The kingdom of God is in your midst," Luke 17:21, or when he told people that the greatest commandment was simply love one another. "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." John 13:34. From the law of one perspective, those statements are not mystical riddles. They are descriptions of a state of consciousness that humanity has not fully developed yet. A preview of what fourth density might look like when it begins to emerge on a planetary scale. But that still leaves a major question unanswered. If a fourth density being incarnated here to share the vibration of love, why choose Earth? A world filled with conflict, division, and confusion. A world where teachings about compassion often seem to be the first things forgotten. According to the law of one, the answer lies in a much larger phenomenon, one that involves not just Jesus, but many other beings who have come here throughout history. If Jesus was what the law of one calls a wanderer, then his life may have been part of a much larger pattern. Because according to the raw material, wanderers are not unique. They are part of a recurring phenomenon in the evolution of planets and civilizations. To understand why they come here, we first have to look at the stage humanity currently occupies. According to the law of one, Earth is nearing the end of a long evolutionary period known as third density, a stage of consciousness centered around choice. The choice between service to others or service to self, compassion or control, unity or separation. It is a stage that can feel chaotic, confusing, and often painful. But according to the raw material, that difficulty is not accidental. It is precisely what creates the conditions for growth. Ra describes the purpose of wanderers this way: "Wanderers are those of the Confederation who have chosen to incarnate in third density in order to be of service to others. They accept the danger of the forgetting in order to aid the planetary consciousness." In other words, wanderers are not here to rule, they are not here to dominate, and they are not here to present themselves as superior beings. Quite the opposite. They voluntarily enter the same confusing environment as everyone else, the same uncertainty, the same emotional struggles, the same limitations of human life. And they do so knowing that once they incarnate, they may forget why they came. This is due to the intensive life experiences and opportunities of the third density. So wanderers come here partly to help, but also to learn. Third density, with all its confusion and complexity, is an extremely powerful catalyst for spiritual growth. It forces consciousness to make choices, to confront fear, to confront anger, to decide how it will respond to suffering and conflict, which, if you think about it, is a little like signing up for the universe's most intense self improvement program. But wanderers are not meant to solve the world's problems directly. They do not arrive with armies, they do not arrive with political authority, and they rarely arrive with a kind of power that would allow them to control events. Instead, their influence is usually subtle. They teach, they inspire, they demonstrate, sometimes through philosophy, sometimes through compassion, sometimes simply through the way they live their lives. and occasionally through the example of a life that leaves a deep impression on human history, which brings us back to Jesus. If the law of one description is accurate, then Jesus was not here to create a religion. He was here to demonstrate something, to show what consciousness looks like when it is oriented fully towards compassion, a living example of fourth density love operating within a third density world. But that example came with a problem, because when new ideas enter a civilization, especially ideas that challenge power structures, they are rarely received in the way the teacher originally intended. Messages become interpreted, stories become expanded, institutions form, and sometimes the original message begins to change. According to the law of one, that is exactly what happened after the life of Jesus. The teachings centered on love and unity did not disappear, but they began to transform into something more structured, more institutional, and occasionally something very different from the original message, which raises another fascinating question. If the life of Jesus was meant to demonstrate the vibration of love, what happened to that message after he was gone? And why did the story of a teacher who emphasized compassion and forgiveness eventually become the foundation of powerful religious institutions? According to the law of one, the answer has to do with a process the material refers to as distortion. If the law of one material interpretation is correct, then the life of Jesus was meant to demonstrate something simple: the vibration of love, not theology, not doctrine, not a complex system of belief, just love expressed through action, forgiveness, compassion, unity. But history has a way of changing things, because when a powerful idea enters a civilization, it rarely stays in its original form for long. People interpret it, debate it, organize around it, and eventually institutions form, which is exactly what happened after the death of Jesus. In the decades that followed the crucifixion, his followers began sharing his teachings across the Roman world. Letters were written, stories were passed down, communities formed around the belief that Jesus had been resurrected. But those communities were not all identical. Different groups emphasized different aspects of his teachings. Some focused on his message of compassion, others focused on his identity as the Messiah. Others emphasized mystical interpretations of his words. Over time, theological disagreements began to emerge. Who exactly was Jesus? A human teacher? A divine incarnation? Something in between? And as Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, these questions became increasingly important because ideas have consequences, and ideas about authority, power, and salvation can shape entire civilizations. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire itself had begun to adopt Christianity. Under Emperor Constantine, the religion that had once been a small movement on the edges of society became closely connected with political power. Church councils were convened, creeds were written, orthodox beliefs were defined, and theological disagreements were settled through formal doctrine. From the perspective of history, this process is often described simply as the institutional development of Christianity. But the law of one offers another way to interpret it. In the raw material, the concept used to describe this transformation is called distortion. Not distortion in the sense of corruption or malice necessarily, but distortion in the sense that any idea, when translated through human perception, gradually changes form. In session 17, question 18, Raw comments on the teachings of Jesus and how they were received. Raw states, the entity known as Jesus was of the highest level of fourth density going into fifth. This entity remembered more than most wanderers. The teachings of this entity were those of love and compassion. However, this information was distorted by those who later interpreted these teachings. In other words, according to the law of one, the message itself was simple, but the interpretations that followed became increasingly complex. And this is not unique to Christianity. Almost every major philosophical or spiritual movement goes through a similar transformation. A teacher introduces an idea, followers attempt to preserve it, communities organize around it, and eventually, structures of authority form to maintain and define the tradition, which is helpful for organization, but not always ideal for keeping the original message simple. Over time, the teachings of Jesus became part of a vast religious system, a system that included theology, rituals, hierarchy, and doctrine. For billions of people around the world, these traditions became meaningful expressions of faith. But from the perspective of the law of one, the core message may have been much simpler than the institutions that eventually formed around it. A message about the nature of consciousness itself, that love is not merely an emotion, it is a state of being, a way of perceiving the world, and that perspective leads to a fascinating possibility. What if the life of Jesus was never meant to establish a permanent religious structure? What if it was meant to demonstrate a stage in the evolution of consciousness? A stage that humanity itself may eventually grow into? A level of awareness the Law of One refers to as fourth density, which brings us to another idea often associated with the teachings of Jesus, a phrase that appears frequently in spiritual discussions today, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes romanticized, but deeply connected to the concept we've been exploring, the idea known as Christ consciousness. Over the past century, a phrase has become increasingly common in spiritual discussions: Christ consciousness. You'll hear it in books, meditation circles, philosophy lectures, sometimes even in casual conversation. But the phrase is often misunderstood. To some people, it simply refers to a mystical feeling. To others, it suggests a divine status reserved for one individual. But when you look closely at the teachings attributed to Jesus, something interesting begins to emerge. Because many of his statements seem to point towards a shift in how people perceive themselves, not just who they worship, but who they are. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his followers something striking. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. John 14:12, which is a curious statement, because it suggests that the abilities or awareness he demonstrated were not meant to remain unique. They were meant to be replicated. Elsewhere, he says something even more direct. It is not written in your law, I have said you are gods. John 10:34. Statements like these have puzzled theologians for centuries. Are they metaphorical, symbolic, hyperbolic, or do they point towards something deeper about the nature of consciousness? From the perspective of the Law of One, these statements take on a very specific meaning. Because in the philosophy, consciousness itself is understood as an expression of the one infinite creator. Every mind, every being, every form of awareness, different expressions of the same underlying source, which means the separation between individuals is, in many ways, temporary, a function of the stage of consciousness we currently occupy. In that sense, the state often described as Christ consciousness is not about becoming a religious figure. It is about perceiving reality through the lens of unity and love, seeing others as extensions of the same consciousness that exists within oneself, which, according to the Law of One, is precisely what fourth density begins to reveal: a stage of awareness where compassion becomes natural, where cooperation replaces competition, where the boundaries between self and other begin to soften. From that perspective, the life of Jesus may not have been intended as proof that one being was divine, but as an example of what consciousness looks like when it begins to operate from that level. By demonstration, a living illustration of the next step in human evolution, which raises a fascinating possibility. What if the purpose of Jesus' life was not to create followers, but to create mirrors, to show humanity a reflection of what it might eventually become? But if that is the case, there's one question that inevitably arises. Because for centuries, many Christians have believed that the story of Jesus is not finished. They believe that one day he will return, a moment sometimes described as the second coming, the day when Christ will appear again to judge the world and establish a final kingdom. But according to the Law of One, that expectation may actually be pointing to something slightly different. For nearly 2,000 years, one idea has remained central to many Christian traditions: the belief that Jesus will return, a future moment often called the second coming. In the New Testament, several passages describe a time when Christ will appear again at the end of the age. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all of the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Matthew 24:30. The book of Revelation expands this imagery even further: a cosmic moment of judgment, the end of the present world order, the separation of righteous and the wicked, a final transformation of earth. For many believers, this future event represents the completion of the story, the return of Christ to judge humanity and establish a divine kingdom. But the Law of One offers a very different interpretation of what this expectation may actually mean. In session 17, question 22, the questioner asks Ra directly about the idea of Jesus returning. Ra responds, "I will attempt to sort out this question. It is difficult. This entity became aware that it was not an entity of itself, but operated as a messenger of the one creator whom this entity saw as love. This entity was aware that this cycle was in its last portion and spoke to the effect that those of its consciousness would return at the harvest. According to the Law of One, Jesus understood something about the timing of human evolution, that the cycle of third density on Earth was approaching its final stage, a transition the material calls harvest. Harvest, in the Law of One framework, is not an apocalypse. It is not the destruction of the world. It is simply a shift in the level of consciousness available on the planet. A transition from third density, the density of choice, into fourth density, the density of love and understanding. But Ra continues with an important clarification. The entity known as Jesus, they say, is not expected to return as an individual incarnation. Ra states, the particular mind body spirit complex you call Jesus is, as what you would call an entity, not to return except as a member of the Confederation, occasionally speaking through a channel. In other words, according to the Law of One, the historical individual known as Jesus is not expected to physically return to Earth. Instead, the idea of his return may refer to something more symbolic. Ra continues, however, there are others of the identical congruency of consciousness that will welcome those to the fourth density. This is the meaning of the returning. In this interpretation, the quote unquote return of Christ is not about the reappearance of one specific person. It refers to the emergence of a level of consciousness, a consciousness centered on compassion, unity, and understanding, the same orientation that Jesus demonstrated during his life. From the perspective of the Law of One, as humanity gradually transitions toward fourth density, beings who already exist within that level of awareness will help guide the transition, not through judgment, not through punishment, but through the same vibration Jesus was said to embody love, which presents a very different image from the dramatic scenes often associated with the end of the world. Instead of a cosmic courtroom, the Law of One describes something more like an evolutionary threshold, a moment when humanity collectively begins to move into a new stage of awareness. Not because one person returned, but because the consciousness that person demonstrated begins to appear more widely on the planet. And if that interpretation is even partially correct, then the story of Jesus may not be about waiting for a savior to return. It may be about preparing humanity to grow into the same level of consciousness he tried to demonstrate, which leads us to the final question of this episode. If the life of Jesus was meant to illustrate a future stage of human evolution, what does that mean for us today? And what might the real message of that story have been all along? When most people think about the story of Jesus, the focus usually falls on a single question. Was he divine? The Son of God? A prophet? A miracle worker? A mythological figure? Or something else entirely? For centuries, debates about Jesus have revolved around that identity, who he was, what powers he had, what authority he carried. But the Law of One invites us to ask a slightly different question. Not just who he was, but what he was trying to demonstrate. Because if the raw material is even partially accurate, then the life of Jesus may not have been intended to prove that one individual was uniquely divine. It may have been meant to show what consciousness looks like when it becomes fully aligned with love, a glimpse of the next stage in human evolution, a demonstration of what the Law of One calls fourth density awareness in the positive sense, a state in which compassion becomes natural, forgiveness becomes instinctive, and the separation between self and others begins to dissolve. When viewed from that perspective, many of the teachings attributed to Jesus begin to sound less like religious commandments and more like descriptions of a future state of mind. Love your enemies, forgive endlessly, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not because a rule demands it, but because at a certain level of awareness, there is no longer a meaningful difference between self and other. The suffering of another person is experienced almost as if it were your own, which may explain one of the most powerful moments in the gospel narrative, a man facing execution, choosing compassion instead of hatred. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Luke 23:34. From the perspective of the Law of One, that moment may not simply be an example of moral virtue. It may be an illustration of fourth density consciousness operating within a third density world, a glimpse of what humanity might eventually grow into, which reframes the story of Jesus in a very different way. Instead of asking whether humanity should worship him, the deeper question becomes, what if the purpose of that life was to show humanity what it could eventually become? A civilization capable of organizing itself around compassion instead of competition, understanding instead of division, cooperation instead of domination. And if that possibility sounds unrealistic, well, history is full of things that once seemed impossible. Human flight, space travel, global communication. All ideas once sounded like fantasy until someone demonstrated they were possible. From the law of one perspective, the life of Jesus may have been a similar kind of demonstration, not a supernatural exception, but an early example of a level of consciousness that humanity itself may one day reach. And if that's true, then perhaps the story of Jesus was never meant to end with worship, or doctrine, or even certainty. Maybe it was meant to end with a question, not about what he was, but about what we might eventually become. Because if one human being could embody that level of compassion, then perhaps the real message of the story is this, that the potential for that same awareness exists in all of us, and that the next stage of human evolution may not be technological or political, but consciousness itself. And if that is the direction humanity is moving, then perhaps the most important part of the story is not something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that may still be unfolding today, quietly, gradually, one choice at a time, one act of compassion at a time, one moment of understanding at a time. If you step back from the debates, the doctrines, the arguments that have surrounded the story of Jesus for centuries, something surprisingly simple begins to appear. A man walking from village to village, speaking about love. Not the abstract kind, not the poetic kind, but the difficult kind. The kind that forgives when it would be easier to resent. The kind that understands when it would be easier to judge. The kind that recognizes another person's humanity, even when they cannot see yours. Whether someone views Jesus as the Son of God, a prophet, a teacher, or something else entirely, one fact remains difficult to ignore. His message was astonishingly consistent. Love one another, forgive one another, care for the poor, see the divine in the least among you. And if the law of one interpretation adds anything to that story, it may simply be this, that those teachings were not just moral advice. They may have been a glimpse of a level of consciousness humanity is still learning to reach, a preview of what awareness begins to look like when separation fades and unity becomes visible. The raw material describes this as a transition into fourth density, a stage of consciousness centered on love and understanding, not imposed from above, not enforced by authority, but grown naturally through the choices individuals make every day. Choices about how we treat each other, choices about how we respond to conflict, choices about whether we act from fear or from compassion. If the story of Jesus represents anything in that context, it may be the reminder that this evolution is not theoretical. It has already been demonstrated, clearly enough to leave an impression that has lasted 2,000 years. And maybe that is why the story continues to resonate, not because it demands belief, but because it quietly suggests a possibility that the qualities Jesus spoke about, forgiveness, empathy, compassion, are not unrealistic ideals. They are early signs of a different way consciousness can operate, a different way humanity can exist. And if that possibility is real, then perhaps the most meaningful question is not whether Jesus was divine, but whether the consciousness he demonstrated is something humanity itself is slowly learning to become. Because if the law of one is correct, the next chapter in human history will not be written by one returning teacher. It will be written by billions of people, each making small choices about how they see one another. Choices about whether we continue reinforcing separation or begin discovering the unity that has always been there. And if that unity truly exists, then perhaps the story of Jesus was never meant to answer all our questions. Perhaps it was meant to leave us with one final idea, that the future of human consciousness may depend less on what we believe and more on how we choose to love. Thank you all for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.